Ukraine will still receive the Russian assets frozen in Europe. The implementation of the European Commission's plan to provide Ukraine with a so-called reparations loan of 140 billion euros using frozen Russian reserves has stalled. Due to Belgium's concern that any disputes will leave them solely responsible, they insist that responsibility be shared among European countries. But it seems that today the actions of the Russians themselves have awakened the Belgian government, and they made a decision in favor of Ukraine. The fact is that today the Prime Minister of Belgium, Bart De Wever, called an emergency meeting of the government's Security Council. After unknown drones were spotted over the country, which not only circled over Brussels airport, but were clearly spying on the country's strategic military facilities. And this Friday, the leaders of the European Commission and the Belgian government will meet to discuss the latter's demands and try to resolve disagreements over the loan for Ukraine. Belgium has put forward three main conditions, the fulfillment of which by the European Commission will fully unlock the possibility of transferring the frozen Russian assets to Ukraine. And importantly, the European Commission stated that these conditions are quite realistic. My name is Alexei Pichi. Let's discuss this topic together, but before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, give it a like, and write any detailed comment under this video. Also, subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pichi News. The link is in the description of this video. There, we publish breaking news as it comes in. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so with any donation or a paid sponsorship subscription. You can do this through the links and details provided. In the video description it says support the Alexei Pichi channel. Use any format you prefer. I will be grateful for any support you give. So, as you know, there have been discussions in Europe for several weeks now about how to transfer frozen Russian assets to Ukraine. But the implementation of the European Commission's plan to issue this reparations loan of 140 billion euros, at least at the expense of frozen Russian reserves, has stalled. Because of Belgium's position, which is objectively afraid that if problems arise, it will simply be left alone to deal with the Russians. In Brussels, there are well-founded fears that after the war, for example, years later, a government in Europe could change and suddenly become friendly toward Russia. And then Belgium, which is holding their frozen Russian assets, will simply be required to return the money to Moscow. And we all remember the era of Merkel and Sarkozy, who kept hoping for some good business relations with Putin. That's why Belgium's concerns are justified. They say, listen, we don't want someone to come to us years later and say, listen, you once handed over frozen Russian assets, but you were responsible for them, so now pay that money back to the Russians out of your own pocket. But today, something happened that further strengthens Belgium's decision to agree to the seizure of assets and their transfer to Ukraine. The example of Belgium. Bart De Wever is convening an emergency meeting of the Security Council after drones were spotted over the country. On Tuesday evening, unidentified drones were spotted over Brussels airport, causing its operations to be halted twice. Drones were spotted over Liège airport as well as near the military air bases of Kleine Brogel, Florennes and Schaffen. The Belgian Prime Minister's spokesperson said a Security Council meeting will be held at the Interior Minister's request. In addition, Belgian Defense Minister Theo Franken is considering the possibility of seeking assistance from NATO. Let me also remind you that last week, unidentified drones were spotted over the Belgian airbase Kleine Brogel, which is actually a key facility for the country's defense. In particular, the drones were spying on F-16 fighter jets. And this Friday, the President of the European Commission will meet with the Belgian government to discuss the issue of transferring frozen Russian assets to Ukraine. And now we're seeing some progress. That very same Prime Minister Bart De Wever. He fears that his country may face the need to return to Russia the amount that the European Union countries plan to transfer to Ukraine from the Bank of Russia's account in the Belgian Euroclear depository. Despite all the assurances from the European Commission that returning the money to Russia will only be possible if it ends the war and pays reparations to Ukraine. At the October meeting of European Union leaders, De Wever demanded stronger guarantees for the frozen assets and put forward three main conditions. First, Belgium wants to eliminate the threat posed by the possibility of Hungary or any other country vetoing sanctions against Russia. Why is this so important? The thing is, sanctions in the European Union are extended every 6 months, and the decision must be made unanimously. If this suddenly doesn't happen, the sanctions are lifted, which will automatically mean the need to return Moscow's assets. Belgium is asking to exclude such a scenario. They say they don't want to worry every 6 months about whether sanctions will be extended. Secondly, Belgium wants other European Union countries to share the risk with it by providing financial guarantees for the loan in case Russia ends the war and demands the return of the assets, or if its lawyers convince the court that it is necessary to do so. The European Commission assures that the likelihood of payment may arise only if Moscow compensates Ukraine for the damage caused by the war, and that European Union countries will provide guarantees. But Belgium wants to be sure that such payments will be made immediately. The Commission has proposed to provide a loan to those countries that cannot quickly transfer the funds, but this would then increase their debt, which is an unpopular measure for many, including France and Italy. Thirdly, Belgium is calling on the European Commission to consider providing loan guarantees from the current European Union common budget rather than from national funds. The European Commission has money in the budget for emergency payments, but it is unclear whether there is enough now to make such commitments. In addition, they will need to be linked to the next 7-year European Union budget, which will only be presented in 2028. And it should be added here that Kiev will have a huge hole in its own budget if financial assistance does not arrive by the spring of 2026. The European Commission aimed to agree with European Union countries on the reparations loan by year end, allowing preparations for its issuance early next year. In other words, everything would have worked out perfectly. In addition, another loan from the International Monetary Fund may also depend on the actions of the European Union, and the fund's mission will soon arrive in Kyiv to discuss providing 8 billion over 3 years. The decision is expected in December. And having a reparations loan from the European Union would show the International Monetary Fund and other investors that Ukraine will remain economically and financially viable in the coming years. But without an agreement on the 140 billion euro reparations loan, which unfortunately can now be expected no earlier than mid-December, after the next European Union Leaders Summit, governments will have to shell out to support Ukraine on their own. The European Commission warns that if we don't agree on the loan, there will be consequences. Well, then each capital will have to allocate a certain amount of money to support Ukraine. It's inevitable, one way or another. There's no question of not allocating anything at all. At the meeting with representatives of Belgium, the European Commission will provide a memorandum with alternative options for financing Ukraine, which involve borrowing within the European Union. And there is hope that De Wever, who also doesn't want to increase his debt, will give in when he sees that there simply aren't any other viable options. Right now everything is coming together a bit late, but still optimally and well. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye.